Dear members of the European Parliament, dear Mr Gemelli, dear colleagues present in the room and connected online, and ladies and gentlemen. As President of the European Parliament Former Members Association, I sincerely welcome you all to this 10th edition of our Librorum event. Interpretation is available in English, Channel 2, French, Channel 3, and Italian, Channel 4. At first, let me welcome in particular our dear member of the Association and former European parliamentarian, Honorable Vitaliano Gemelli, who wrote the book we are presenting today, which is entitled Finance for Society. Very simple, very clear.
Yes.
But you will say something to that. That's why you are here and why we are here. Our Vice President, Monica Baldi, whom I thank for being with us today and for coordinating the organization of our Librorum event, will introduce Mr. Gemelli and his book in her intervention. Our audience today is composed mainly of former member MEPs, and I want to greet my friend and colleague, former President of the European Parliament, José María Robles, who is connected online. And I'm sure he will be happy to hear we will be happy to hear his important voice during the debate on this crucial issue for today's society. But let me quote once Mr. Gemelli himself, his book. This book presents a political vision of the existing problems without presuming to have sociological or economic expertise. That is a good thing, I think. But only on the basis of sensitivity deriving from experience in national and European institutions, the political events of the present day are intertwined with significant economic events such as the crisis. It is a book of stringent and very topical relevance in the historical context we are currently living and fits well with the topic well dealing with tomorrow morning at our annual seminar. We look forward to listening to the presentation of the book by our Vice President of the Association, Monica Baldi. And
Thank you, President Klaus Hänsch. Un cordiale saluto a tutti i presenti. Today, previous editions of Librorum is a turn of Vitaliano Gemelli. He presents his book, Finance for Society, From Dominance to Service, Sign of the Need for a Transformation, which will be the subject of the debate coordinated by the FMA board member, Paul Rübig. Il libro, La finanza per la società.
The book Finance for a Society from Domination to Service hints at the needs for transformation was published in 2017, and it has been translated into 5 languages: English, German, French, and German, and Spanish. So before talking about the book and the author, I would like to greet all the members present with us today: Miguel Angel Martinez, Michael Hindley, and Pier Antonio Panzeri, and of course Dr. Susi Di Martini. It's very important that today we can really discuss the issues that Mr. Gemelli described in his book. He has been a Euro parliamentary in the People's Party, has been commissioned for the petitions and member for the cooperation. He's been on the Committee for Foreign Affairs, Human Rights, Common Security and Defense Policies. He's also been a member of the CVU for Caribbean, African countries, for East Europe, for the Mediterranean region. And 5 years ago, Nino, who knows very well the institutions in Italy and in Europe, presented for the first time here in the European Parliament this book. And the President, Baron Crespo, who also extends his greetings to all of you, back at the time said that this was a revolutionary book because it talks about finance for society. And this is particularly important considering today's world with the globalization of financing. And it's very important, the other part of the title, From Domination to Service, because nearly never we mention this, that finance is part of a public service. The author decided to represent the world perspective and decided so to talk about all these topics that might be often treated with arrogancy, but here we see some data that refer to finance speculation and to finance in general, which can be to the service of humans and the society, but only if its scope is well defined. It is important then to be accountable, and the member states need to be accountable, in particularly with regards to the budgeting and to the financing. This way we can really have a democratic government with clear and ethical financial rules. So a system that can be clear, and I'm talking about organizations such as the WTO or a labor organization, which should really revise their basics about the finance market, including the labor market. Of course, the politics should really be at the service of the public and not of the private sector. This is not just for financing, but also for other companies. And it is important then to create a banking and financing system that is sustainable based on investments and not on bets. The system must be resilient and productive without gaining any advantage. Financial markets, they must support the real economy and not just speculation. The legislation activity, and I'm talking about the book, it's very important because there are some elements that really help us to reflect on the current situations and beyond. So what we saw in the financial crisis in 2008 brought up many lobbyings in the financing sector. So it is important that this, the civil society and political leaders work together to contrast and fight the finance lobbying. We start with a historical overview from the 80s and 90s, and it is important to make sure that all these aspects are taken into account, and we have an example of this in the current crisis. And it is also important to remember the international communication, which really requires a growth from the whole society, particularly for the new generations, which on one hand are available and enthusiastic, but on the other end, they are not ready for innovations and changes. With regards to the labor world, it is important to analyze in details all the providers, taking into account the productive system, which is particularly variable, and working cycles cannot just be compared to the people, but we also need to take into account life expectancy. The industry really needs to keep specializing because we have a demand that is supported by new needs which raise profits. So consumers are attracted by advertising and by current trends to buy new products that can really change the concept of utility, not just by basic and real needs. And the virtual era really has changed the system of people. We have seen a new urban mobilization and personal relationship, and to really stand out in the society, we often want to show, not show ourselves, but just show our appearance. For example, we see on social networks, we have fake profiles or groups. So we've seen second lives. So this attempt to homologate the society that is changing creates a situation that really avoids any unicity.
Che si manifesta in una costante insoddisfazione della persona.
This brings to people to be continuously unsatisfied with their lives within the society they live in, and on the other hand, society becomes the prompt to always achieve new and higher results. And as Nino says in his book, and I'm quoting, people are always at the center of government and evolution processes, and therefore it will be necessary to set a paradigm, a framework for any evolution system, from information to communication, from the production of goods, services, and finance, from scientific and technical analysis to high algorithms, and overcoming traditional and religious barriers. And this has not an empty space as a perspective, but instead we need to strive to achieve a common ethics or a universal ethics. And this universal ethics is an aspect that he really underlines. And nature has its own ethics. This system has its own balance while being based on a common ecosystem. This universal ethics, this natural ethics should characterize the future of any generation and should also be the common base for any theory that goes against its affirmation. And for Mr. Gemelli, we need to acquire the common values of our European belonging so that society in a European framework becomes a champion of integration, solidarity, and mutual support in order to affirm these solidarity and this culture and to achieve the common good for all people. And his recipe is that of strengthening the bodies of democracy on any institutional level. We need to work not only on a social level, but also on the economic and financial levels by strengthening and fostering these levels with quality products, with the trackability of products, and by defending small enterprises and craftsmanship and the trade in urban fabric, and also by supporting our architecture, our culture, and protecting and spreading our values and with transformation processes for our cities. And I really underline this point because we need cities which are tailored to the life of people who need to live there. And by recovering the historical spaces in our countries, to make people so that people have the chance to work there in our cities, but also enjoy their lives in these common spaces and improve their quality of life. Therefore, the protection of our territories are an element which has to be protected and promoted, whereas the expenses, on the other hand, may bring to detriment of the environment. Therefore, we need to avoid any damage to the future of our populations, of our peoples. And therefore, in the book, there are some examples of the dynamics which are involved in the evolution of the populations of the various continents. And I do not want to take any longer in this, and I want to leave the space to Mr. Gemelli for his presentation. I just wanted to give some hints about what you can find in the book. And I think that this book is really worth reading because it really underlines the importance of our institutions and the respect that Mr. Gemelli has for our common institutions. And with a plain language and a transparent language, which also shows his European spirit, the author suggests that our regulations are really useful, but only when some elements are and some requirements are met. Therefore, congratulations, Nino, and I will now leave the floor to you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for this beautiful introduction. At first, first of all, I wanted to thank Klaus Hänsch, the president of the European Parliament Former Members Associations, the vice president, and the entire board, the colleagues who agreed to join us today, both online and in person. I know that uh, beyond our colleague, in addition to our colleagues, there are also other professionals who are with us today. I also want to thank the association, with which I have a deep friendship. I've been working with them and collaborating with them for a long time. And I've been working with Elisabetta for a long time, and I want to thank her for assisting me while preparing this presentation. I want to thank them all because they thought that presenting this book, my contribution was worth. And Enrique Baron Crespo also and Lorenzo Cesa also helped me present this book a while ago. I want to greet them for their participation. Lorenzo is currently a member of the Italian Parliament, and therefore I want to thank them also for helping me with this. The problem that we have today is mainly is globalization, because globalization, which at first we welcomed as something which broke the barriers and helped us overcome the limits that we had. In the end, with the management that we had over globalization over the last 30 years, we came to the conclusion that the evolution that we were expecting from globalization itself did not achieve its result, because the current situation that we are living nowadays brings us to consider the world divided into blocks. Therefore, we have the Western bloc And we have another block which is represented by BRICS, and we also have a series of countries which are outside these blocks, but they still participate in one block or the other. And I do not want to go back and to what Monica already said because her introduction was excellent and she covered all the main aspects which I cover in my essay. I only want to start from an insight. We opened the world with a fall of the Berlin Wall. And Gorbachev and Reagan understood precisely that the world had to include several poles. The Cold War was over, and the fight between the two blocks was over, and at that point, the world had multiple blocks because in global dialogue, this global dialogue also included China and India, which had always been there, but in a secondary position for some events and situations that were going on in India. But in any case, that world was going to open its way to an overall dialogue. And the collapse of communism left some space to new theories, to liberalist theories, and according to this theory, everything has to be done and accomplished following its principles. If this only concerns economy, um, that may work, but economy has to work for society. And at that point, uh, this kind of economy only offers a single culture that in a diverse society cannot find its place. Therefore, today we have 8 billion individual thoughts. And this is today's world, today's society. And 8 billion people, 8 billion minds cannot be only included in a single culture. Throughout the history of the world, globalization has always existed. The first one was the one from Greece, because Greece had the chance to expand its borders. They also achieved Italy and they went beyond it. Also, through some of their great characters, some of their great people, and they gave a specific character to that kind of globalization because globalization also always follows the communication that is spread across territories. The second globalization that we lived was the one of the Roman Empire, and it was not only the Roman Empire. Globalization had also started from the republics in Rome. And then other globalizations followed. At some point, we also had a globalization from the Ottomans from the Ottoman Empire or from the Mongolian Empire when they invaded China. Therefore, we always witnessed these globalizations, and they ended when this series of globalization ended when the principles of the populations that were touched by these globalization processes were not respected. When the Roman civilization and other civilizations were organized according to the culture of the people that were uh, in the places that they had invaded. When that happened, the principles of those peoples were respected. But when a single power wants to uniform all the countries and all the peoples, that represents the beginning of the end for the globalization. And we also witness various globalization processes, such as the empire of Charles V. And he said that the sun never set on his empire because he had conquered basically the entire world that was known by then. But this globalization processes always end when a single culture wants to impose itself on other cultures. And at that point, globalization processes cannot be executed and performed with a single culture that imposes itself. They have to look for a dialogue between various cultures. When we say that we cannot export a democracy, we're actually saying that because democracy has to be a legacy, something which is in the citizens. Therefore, we cannot say, as we said for Arabic Spring, that we are exporting democracy in those territories if the citizens of those lands, of those countries, do not have the principle and the idea of democracy in their minds. The ideas of dignity, of parity and equality, if they do not have that kind of culture, we cannot say that we are exporting democracy and we are carrying out a war in Egypt and then we are bringing a democracy there, or like what happened in Tunisia or in Libya, where we are still witnessing uh, uh, an insecure situation nowadays. And that kind of globalization, the globalization that we are living today, is a globalization that we have to reconsider because we cannot accept that kind of single thought and single culture. And an insight that was a revolution to European observers was the issue of Obamacare, which ran the risk of being repealed by the American people because a great number of American people didn't want their citizens to be supported by the state as for issues concerning their health. Well, this insight shows us that we are not considering the great mechanisms behind finance, but we are taking into consideration the individual citizens who do not have the chance to pay for their health. And the principle of this culture is that everyone has to live with what they can produce. But if one person doesn't have the chance to live on their efforts, what do they have to do? Well, when Obama proposed his Obamacare, Trump tried to repeal the Obamacare, and that was not only Trump, but a great majority of Americans supported that idea. And in some moments, when there was the development of the world after the Second World War, the Keynesian policies were practiced, and in the United States, they were proposed by Kennedy and the counselor and his counselors. And for a long time, even after the Kennedy's assassinations, was still there to lead the U.S. economy, and therefore we need to say that unfortunately this kind of reality, which is globalization and which globalization is giving us 30 years after its beginning and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, can no longer support its system. And what's happening with this culture and with this kind of proposal? Well, there's a verticalization of power, and also finance and financial resources are in the hands of a few operators, and there are mega stores popping up for trade, and this has an impact on small stores, small shops. And when that happens, there are no longer uh, freelance workers that were also represented by that system, and therefore workers will all need to become employees, because if they are all employees, you can organize the world of employment with with the same criteria that apply to all people, to all employees, and that are conceived to maximize profit. And that creates a world that is no longer resilient, because bigger structures do not have the flexibility and the resilience on their own. And just a couple of examples from the 2008 Lehman Brothers crisis. And another example is the Evergrande, the Chinese Evergrande, the greatest company in the estate sector in China, that was considered too big to fail, but that was not true, of course. And with Lehman Brothers and Evergrande, I think there are many other examples like that, which are supported by the help from the state, because, of course, states cannot allow these episodes to represent a risk for the entire system. And there's another insight that I would like to analyze with you, and that is the idea that if this is the society and the perspective that we are building, we will have financial problems, the because big companies of any kind will disappear, because they will no longer have the possibility to be supported by the population, because the population will be poorer and poorer. The various social layers were pressured down, and therefore poverty is bigger, has become bigger over the last period. And therefore, if this 8 billion people can no longer buy, because they do not have the financial resources to buy, and they do not have the resilience to support this situation, at that point we will basically have this insight, and that is the collapse of big companies.
And this also entails that countries and states will have to step in. So the higher the contribution from the state and the higher the cost that the government will have to have. On the other hand, if citizens will be able to improve their own financial and economic situation and therefore improve their status, and the less will be the state contribution, because citizens will be able to support and satisfy their own needs with their own means. And if that's not the case, then the state will have to step in, and the social impact will be very high. So this is a really important point. I think that the US public debt on an aggregate, so we're talking about the federal state, the 50 US states, and the big cities in the states have an enormous debt. And the public debt in China is also very scarily high. So how can we find a balance? part of the US debt has been included by the Chinese finance, and part of the Chinese debt is included by the American finance. So this is a point of balance. But if this balance breaks, what will happen? So this is the crucial question today. I'm going to I'll quickly go over because Monica has already said a lot. So just a few other points to raise. The world we live in today is defined as anthropocene, anthropogenesis. We talked about the Anthropozoic era by Stopardi, Nomosphere, and Holocene and Anthropocene. And this term was used, and Romano Gualtini imagines a societies in the 60s where we have a man that won't be human anymore and nature won't be natural anymore. This is the perspective that was given back in the days. And Fukuyama talks about the end of history and the last man, because this single culture might lead to this. And before, Bauman talked about a liquid society where everything was fluid, let's say. Fukuyama says and wonders if the civilization will have an end. Who decides when to end the civilization? So what does that link to? Who determined the beginning of a civilization and its own end? Huntington, an American author, says that the world cannot live with a single culture or a bipolar culture, but needs to live in a multipolar organization. And if we live in a multi-layer organization, then we will be able to govern the world, because the world government is really an essential point here. And just before I conclude, on the 28th of July 2022, we have decided that that's the overshot day. So after that date, we know that we are borrowing resources. 29th of July, sorry. So we have 8 billion people in the world who buy 2,600,000,000 tons of food supplies. It's an enormous number. But we have 820 million people who live in an absolute poverty state. So they're in hunger. But we waste 1,300,000,000 of this food that we buy. So a third of all the food that we purchase gets wasted. So why can't we give this waste to the 120 million people who live in hunger? Because that 1.3 billion food is a bargaining chip, whereas the 820 million people who live in hunger need some food, because otherwise they can't really eat. And another part regards research. Research is a very essential part in our life. It's highly sophisticated, and we could not govern the research if we didn't have dedicated agencies. So the research starts from military systems and goes beyond, because it goes to the civil society. However, if we cannot govern the research, later we will have products that we cannot sustain. So today, let's imagine hackers who can really hack into any IT system all around the world. Despite all of these systems are closed and have cybersecurities. Despite of this, though, hackers can break in. And if this can happen in the military agencies, for example, to launch a missile, you can imagine what could happen. What if the military systems were hacked? Or what if a biological company gets hacked? What could that happen? So all of these points really have to be under control. So thank you for listening to all these points, which is an annex to my book, and I'll be happy to circulate it to the members of the associations if anybody wants to read it, because there are some food for thoughts into this book. Nobody has their own truth, but I think it's important to share our point of views, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Vitaliano Gemelli, a former association member and author of that book you presented. And we come now to the question and answer session and between the audience. And I am very glad that Paul Rübig, member of our board, kindly agreed to moderate the question and answer session with the audience, and we are very grateful for that. Please, Paul.
Yes, first of all, many thanks to our new president, Hänsch. I remember that he was the first president where I came into European Parliament, so that was a very nice area. I also know that we are internet with our former president Gilles Robles with us, and of course also De Martini is with us. It's good to see that Gemelli has written a book also about principles of how to live together and how to form a global understanding for each other. So what he made, I think, in a very outspoken way, it's a respect between different cultures, respectful treatment of other cultures, the tolerance, also against other systems. We know that we are living in a democratic system, but I think it's also necessary to have respect and tolerance to other systems. And we know that the finance for the society is treated totally different around the globe. If you look to euro, to pound, to US dollar, and on the other side to China, Japan, and India, you know that we are always living in a kind of war. And in the economic area and in the finance world, and now newly also in the military world, it's a hybrid war. So it's moving quite quick through the different societies. And we had now a tour through the history of Europe. And the last 70 years have shown to us that it's possible to accept other opinions, and we are all in the generation where our first target was to work together. I always said, let's first solve the 90% where we are all within one opinion, and then go to the 10% where it's a little bit more difficult. But first the 90%, and then the 10%. And now, when I look to the European institutions, I got a little bit the impression that they start with the 10%, where they have not the same opinion, and wait for the time where maybe consensus is possible. So, in European Parliament, we all learned that we are acting globally. You know, everybody had a country, an area, and continent where he was responsible for. I remember that within the WTO, we started the parliamentary conference of the WTO, not going into a trade war, negotiation on the table in Geneva, around the world with the ministerials. And I think that was a good way. And it's also better to have trade agreements than starting a trade war. And we have seen that the United States started not in improving WTO, improving trade agreements. They started America first. And, you know, with America first, of course, they punished long-standing trade partners, and the conflicts got more and more deeply. So, Gemelli has shown to us that now we are 8 billion people in this world. And by 2050, if there's not a nuclear strike or whatever, a war, maybe we are 10 billion people. And how could we feed 10 billion people? And in STOA, you know, in the scientific committee of the European Parliament, it was clear that we have to find solutions how to feed 10 billion people. And the real issue is on the need on our consumers. How can we serve our consumers best? And in this area, it's a question of energy which gets more and more important. It's a question of food, where we have to take care that everybody has the chance to get the right quantity and quality. And which is totally underestimated, it's water. So if you see to the Sustainable Development Goals, number 2 is food and feed. Number 6 is water and a circular economy in water. And number 7 is renewable energy. So number 2 is the green agenda, number 6 the blue agenda, and number 7 the yellow agenda. And I think that could be the solution for the finance for the society. It's not only money. I think it's a fair way how to treat each other and how to find solutions where everybody can live with. So, that was a short introduction. We have 2 friends, which maybe also want to say something now, loudly. Huh?
Now.
Okay, so the first question or the first remark, please. Aha, okay, set the list. Okay, the first one is President Gil Robles. It's now your turn. Please start and speak. Yes, you can speak now. And you need the micro to open. We lost the connection. So do we get the connection again? Should we take De Martini? Okay, then De Martini, please.
Ok, allora grazie mille a tutti.
Thank you all for the great organization for former members, to the new president, to vice president, and Italian colleague. And of course, thank you to Mr. Gemelli. We know that humanity and economies are two words that sometimes are difficult to put together, and you managed to do so. So thank you for that. Just a comment and a project for the future, a comment, like a historical comment. You mentioned Pax Mongolic, the Mongolian peace, which was a long-lasting empire, and an historian from the age mentioned that in the Mongolian area, a virgin with holding a tray back at the time could really go around without being disturbed, and that's a very good example of a peace. But what was the price to reach that situation? I'd like to remind you that Genghis Khan, when used to conquer a village, would cut off the left ear of all the people, including children and women, and would send them to the next village, so that the next village would just surrender without fighting. So the price probably was a bit high. But thank you for talking about that. And just another comment, a project that perhaps we could work on as former members, that is the health expenditure. The COVID pandemics really made us understand how the health system of many countries did not work. And we've seen this in the US, in Europe, and in China. We know that the zero COVID policy is still giving issues. So what could we do? How can we bring this dialogue even further? Because this was already started. And I'm saying this as a doctor living in New York. And this has also had an economical impact. We spoke about the Obamacare, and it's not a simple issue. And Modigliani, an economist, started to talk about it, and he started off this association of Italian teachers, and I'm part of this group. So the US spends about 9% of its GDP on health policies, and Italy ranks at 16th in this ranking. So other European countries such as Poland or Hungary spend around 4%. So we really need to think a bit more about this, and perhaps we could start a study to determine which one is the best health system and the one that we would like to create. And so I think that since there is many doctors amongst us, I think many of us could really think to start a project like this in the future. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. You mentioned in your talk, Kennedy, I'm reminded of one of his advisors, who was J.K. Galbraith, who actually, in my time, spoke to the European Parliament. He wrote a very good book. I'm getting an echo. Is everyone getting this echo? Okay. Called A Short History of Financial Euphoria. When asked by the Senate if there'd be another crash, because he wrote a history of the 29 crash, he said, crashes are endemic in the system. 2008 was an example. People surf along this wave of what Monica called gambling. It collapses. The state, sometimes reluctantly, on behalf of the citizens, intervened, as Obama did in 2008. Galbraith also said that the private sector still resists as much reform as it can do, and there's a compromise, there's new regulations, and then, as he put it, the clever boys and girls, mathematicians, find a way of circumventing the new regulations, and off we go again. So how do you break out of this system? The other point quickly I'll make, do you think that many of the social, health, education systems, which in our own history we've increasingly asked the state to provide, are now in danger of being privatized and becoming part of the market economy? There are certain issues that you cannot solve by the market. If I have a heart attack tomorrow, there's no way that privately, by my own savings, I could pay the cost. And also, I depend on my tax money paying for doctors and surgeons and nurses to deal with that emergency. So are we going too far down the road of thinking the market will solve our problems? Final point, you didn't mention an area which also interests me when I'm in Italy. You have a quite thriving cooperative sector. Would you say something more about the third sector as an economic organization?
Yes, should we try President Gil Robles again? Huh? Maybe it's possible now. Yes, President Gil Robles, now we are back again, and hopefully you can speak now. It's now your turn. Please speak. Yes, we can hear. Unmute, yes, and use the microphone. Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, but I have not asked the floor.
Okay, so we are happy that you are with us, and hopefully you stay with us. And now we ask Mr. Gemelli to give the answer on the questions which were placed. Please.
Sì, grazie.
Thank you so much. Well, undoubtedly, I will reply to both questions at the same time. I think that the market cannot solve everything, because basically the market is only an aspect of the life of people, but there are various aspects in the life of a person who involve empathy that people have with other people, and therefore market is also subject to empathy and to the choice that people make, and people choices are connected to their culture, their lives, their lifestyle, their possibilities, their skills, to a series of aspects, and to the way they represent themselves in the society. And therefore, the market is not a means to solve all problems. Of course, when we decided that the market, and we entrusted the market with the solution of all problems, I think that at that point we made our a mistake, because the market cannot solve all the issues. There's also another point. In many countries, in my country as well, we often made various services private because privatization was a synonym for efficacy, because private services are considered to be more efficient than public services, because whereas in the private sector there is the principle of efficiency, in the public sector, at least in my state, there is no principle of productivity. Therefore, if we are employed by the state, and if we have 10 operations to carry out, we only complete 2 of those operations. And therefore, we need to receive an award if we complete more tasks than what we are supposed to do. And therefore, entrusting services to the private sector created many misunderstandings, and also concerning the financial sector. And the bigger cities, at least in my countries, in bigger cities, public services such as transportation or recycling or services for water distribution do not work properly, because we also apply that privatization process as for water distribution, and I think that all of that should be reconsidered. Of course, we need the market. The market needs to be a parameter to evaluate solution, but that cannot be the solution to all problems. Thank you.
Much. Any other request or question or comment on what you have heard? Is somebody from the internet, from the remote activity asking for the floor? If this is not the case, of course, our President Hänsch, will give a final comment. Please.
Then I take my part. It is the most easiest one. I would like simply to thank Mr. Vitaliano Gemelli for his participation in this Librorum event. I would like to thank the speakers, Vice-President Monica Baldi and Board Member Paul Rübig, our members and guests, and wish you all a nice evening. And I declare the event closed.
And Martini is now hopefully outside. Huh?
Yeah.